Okay, I'm gonna get started so that we have lots of time for our incredible panelists. I'm gonna share my screen. I can figure that out. Okay, let me go into presenter view. Oh, okay, I hope you're seeing that okay. Interrupt me if not. Welcome to the last in our spring series of webinars from the SCBNA, Society for Conservation Biology, North America Student Affairs webinar series. My name is Melissa Cronin. I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz and the student rep to the board of SCBNA, and of course a member of the Student Affairs webinar series. And I'm so thrilled to present this webinar today. It's going to be a really special one, and we have some wonderful panelists. So I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping first and then turn it over very shortly to our panelists. So first things first, what are we? Who are we? Like I said, we are a student group within SCBNA, and SCBNA is of course a chapter of the Global Society for Conservation Biology. If you're interested in getting more involved either with North America or with SCB, these are some options for involvement here. So you can always join a section, working group. Importantly, there is a social science working group that's probably very interesting to a lot of folks here, and you can find more information about that on the website. You can certainly subscribe to journals, all that good stuff. If you're a student, undergrad, grad, or any type of student, even a lifelong student, please feel invited to join the Student Affairs Subcommittee. We're a very informal group, and we just do stuff like this, putting on webinars. We're always looking for more participants. So if that's something that's interesting to you, you can email me at mecronin@ucsc.edu, and I can always drop my email in the chat as well. We have one more webinar in the fall focused on equity and inclusion in conservation and research. So keep an eye out for that. The date is to be determined, but it should be a really nice webinar. Okay, getting back to the hour at hand. We're presenting today a webinar on conservation and social science, harnessing interdisciplinary methods for complex issues. Before I go into this, I have to acknowledge the organizers of this panel, Andu and Veronica, who are both on the call. They did all the heavy lifting, so we should really give them credit for making this panel happen. And just a note before we begin, if you have questions, we'll have a whole chunk of time at the end, quite a bit of time for questions, and I'm sure there'll be tons for our panelists. You can either raise your hand during that time or during their talk. If you think of something you want to know, feel free to put that question in the chat and we'll collect those and we can ask them at the end. But we'll wait till the end for questions. Okay, without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our panelists. I'm gonna give you the bio for just one of them, and then we can hear about the other one in a moment. But first, I'll introduce Dr. Arundhati Jagadish, who is a social scientist at Conservation International. Arundhati is interested in applying diffusion of innovations theory and cognitive anthropological perspectives of human decision-making to conservation practice. Broadly, her research interests include diffusion of innovations, cultural modes of decision-making, social networks, socio-ecological systems, interactions between humans and non-humans, and coexistence and conservation. Really broad, amazing, amazing topics. So at CI, at Conservation International, her research focuses on the diffusion of conservation interventions, specifically the spread and adoption of conservation interventions like large marine protected areas in the Pacific and Western Indian Ocean. This work is part of a larger attempt to integrate evidence-based decision-making in conservation practice and accelerate the growth of these LMMAs. She holds a PhD in forestry and natural resources from the University of Georgia, a master's in environmental studies from the Environmental Research Institute in India. And she's previously worked in the Himalayas and in India. So thank you so much for being here, Arundhati. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to join today, and thank you so much for including me in this panel. I'm going to share my screen to share a little bit more about my work. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, as Megan mentioned, so I'm part of a larger initiative called the Alliance for Conservation and Sustainability. But within CI, my work has largely focused on understanding how and why conservation initiatives scale. My interest in this work stems from a lot of my doctoral work was focused on technology adoption and technology diffusion. And we're using that same theoretical social science framing into understanding how and why conservation initiatives can scale. And obviously, scaling has recently acquired a lot of momentum. There's a lot of conversations around scaling the scope of our solutions to match the scale of our problems. But there are also issues with what scaling means for different people, what different initiatives, how they pan out over space and time, and what can social science theories like diffusion of innovations tell us or help us out with. So so that's a broad challenge that my work focuses on at CI. And as I mentioned, this diffusion of innovations theory is the broad framing for my work. It looks at three main components. One is just the innovation, which in our cases would be different conservation initiatives. And these initiatives could be, a payment for ecosystem services project or a community-based conservation project, locally managed marine areas, which is a case study that I'm focusing on. Then there is the adopters, which could, it could be communities, could be individuals, nonprofits, donors. And then there is the larger context, so the geographical, cultural, political context within which the adoption takes place. So this is just, we started exploring this question several years ago, almost 5 to 7 years ago, where we started mapping how over time different conservation initiatives have scaled. So this is just looking at the temporal aspect of it. So over time, we looked at 22 different initiatives and checked what was the diffusion curve looking like for those, which brought us to this question of, everyone talks about the S-shaped diffusion curve, how quickly some initiatives diffuse, how some of them are much slower, and what are we learning? How do we explain these different trends and patterns? So as part of this project that I'm working on at CI, we're looking at several different conservation initiatives, and several types of them too. So we have the wildlife management units in Mexico. We're looking at TERFs in Chile. TERFs are territorial user rights of fisheries. We have municipal MPAs in Philippines and locally managed marine areas, both in the Pacific Islands and the Western Indian Ocean. So just a brief background on the locally managed marine areas, something that I have been focusing on for the last 2 years. So in Fiji, there are parts of the customary waters where communities fish that are reserved under some kind of marine management. And those marine management could be a tambu, which is a closure site for different species, for different gears, or they could be both permanent and rotational. And then there are larger management issues with participation and governance and how communities find ways to gain stewardship over their resources, but also engage with the government to claim those rights. So locally managed marine areas can mean many different things, but it's in the end a suite of different practices that are applied. So we started with, again, looking at how they've spread over space and time. So we started mapping those, and then we did a survey with the village leaders across 150 villages in Fiji to try and understand the reasons for why LMMAs were adopted. So some of the results for the study are still preliminary. We're still building these models. But the really interesting part that I really enjoyed moving from like a small scale 8-village study during my PhD to this countrywide focus was this idea of both spatial patterns and temporal trends and how socioeconomic data can be integrated with these models to look at a more comprehensive, holistic model to explain these trends. So as I mentioned, this whole thing is part of the Alliance for Conservation and Sustainability. This is a community-based conservation-focused network of different organizations that's looking at the establishment of the different initiatives, the governance of the persistence of them, and their scaling over time. So it's covering these 3 different cycles or the 3 different processes within it. And at more center at CI, there are other different initiatives that we also work with. So one is looking at just the governance atlas. So that's a global database that looks at the diversity and dynamics of area-based conservation systems. Then there's also a big focus on impact evaluation and most specifically focused on natural climate solutions. So within the social science team, we're looking at the where, the why, and the how aspects of conservation. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Arundhati. Excuse me, I was just having a snack. Okay, wonderful. We're going to move over to our next panelist. I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry. Okay. Great. Meredith Gore is our next panelist. So Dr. Meredith Gore is a conservation social scientist who uses risk concepts to build new understandings of human-environment relationships. Her research is designed to build evidence for action. The majority of her activities can be described as convergence research on conservation issues such as wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, fishing, and mining. She received a PhD in natural resource policy and management from Cornell University, in environmental and resource policy from George Washington University, and a BA in anthropology and environmental studies from Brandeis. From 2006 to just recently, 2020, she was faculty at Michigan State University, and she is a National Academies of Sciences Jefferson Science Fellow, U.S. Department of State Embassy Science Fellow, and Emerging Wildlife Conservation Leader. Welcome, Meredith. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be able to complement the really amazing kind of interdisciplinary methods that you focused on, Arundhati. So thank you for that. I'm gonna also share my screen, and what I wanted to do was, I guess, try to answer some of the questions that were posed to me in the invitation email. So like, how did I get into conservation social science, and how do I use it, and how can conservation social science be used to improve conservation goals? So please, if you have a question, let me know at any time. I think it's really, and this picture is just too much of me, so sorry about that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about my motivations and privileges. So how did I get into conservation social scientists? Like, what's my origin story? I like to say that humans are my species, but I've been trained in interdisciplinarity. So I sometimes forget that I'm kind of in the middle of everything. So what do they say? Like, I'm a mile wide sometimes, and I don't know how deep I am, but I really enjoy being able to conduct research on the ground with communities, with different publics, and then also really high level parastatals, United Nations or governments. I think that one thing that I've really benefited from as a student in the United States is being able to go to a land-grant university. So I did my PhD at a land-grant university. I was tenured at a land-grant university at Michigan State University, and now I'm tenured at University of Maryland. And so this idea of conducting applied research, I've essentially been doing this for 25 years now. So I think that has really privileged me in my ability to do conservation and social science research. It's really important that I acknowledge my support systems, because I've been really fortunate to have my parents in particular, and my stepmom, who have been amazingly supportive of me. I have worked really hard to develop personal and professional networks, and I think that I would really just be remiss if I didn't acknowledge how much they privilege me. Also, I fail all the time. I fall all the time. And I think that I try to have this kind of like fail forward personality. And so what I'm going to show you in a couple of slides are mostly successes, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the failures, because that's kind of how I've been able to get to where I am in conservation social science. Plus the Society for Conservation Biology. I was part of the SSWG, I'm past president. The Society for Conservation Biology has really been an amazing professional society home for me. And so We're not a perfect society, but I really think we're kind of amazing. So my interdisciplinary research, like how I use conservation social science and how I use interdisciplinary methods, I've been using what we call kind of conservation criminology. And so this is an interdisciplinary framework to think about environmental harm. And so in some situations, you have a conservation crime, like wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, illegal fishing, wildlife trafficking, illegal sand mining. You have this problem and you need to think about the conservation biology dimensions. You need to think about natural resource policy and management, the community ecology, the ecosystem function, the human dimensions, right? But then you also need to think about criminology and criminal justice. So, who are the guardians? What about compliance? How do you deter people from breaking rules? How do you promote compliance with rules? How do you prevent violations? A lot of the times in conservation, we're trying to get, we want to prevent harm, prevent risk, prevent crime from happening in the first place. Once the coral reef has been blown up, it's blown up. Once the tree is cut, it's cut. Once the elephant is killed, it's dead. Once the ranger has been, shot or the poacher has been shot, you can't bring these people back. And so I think thinking about these criminology dimensions is really important. There's also this risk and decision science side of things. We need to be able to quantify and qualify numerically the relationships and estimates and quantify uncertainty. We need to think about how to communicate risks and how we, incorporate expert perceptions and public perceptions. And then all of this is kind of overlaid by this idea that we're talking about risk, we're talking about harm, we're talking about rule violations. And sometimes it can be a violation of the rule of law, but sometimes it's like rules in use, like it's just a social norm. How many times has anybody ever, walked by a recycling bin and you throw your piece of paper in the trash instead, and then you like turn around and you take the piece of paper out of the trash can and you put it in the recycling bin. That's a social norm at work, right? So this idea of conservation criminology, I've been working on it for, since about 2007. And so lots of failures, lots of amazing collaborations. But I thought maybe I'd try to give you two illustrations about how conservation criminology has been used to improve conservation goals. And so the first example that I wanted to share was about rosewood logging in Madagascar. And, in many ways, rosewood logging in Madagascar is a challenge like many other places in the world. You have a very valuable species of tree, and it's cut illegally. So the question then is, how do you prevent illegal logging from occurring? How do you respond to it? And so what my work has involved is, participatory mapping. And so you integrate conservation biology data. So this is on the eastern coast, the eastern coast of Madagascar. This is Ile Sainte-Marie, for those of you that are familiar with the geography of the eastern part of the island. And so, you can take land cover maps. And so, a forest ecologist can tell you that, there's different microclimate habitats that create the proper conditions for trees to grow. And so this is where illegal logging could happen. And so what I've done is I've adapted way more social science methods to try to complement this. So what we do is, along with a team of many people, we've done participatory risk mapping. So we take plastic and we overlay it on these maps, and we ask people to draw meaningful places, meaningful spaces, meaningful flows. And so what you can see is people mapped where are the trees, where are the flows, where are the stockpiles. And so, you have markers and stickers and pens and tape and then you replicate this mapping activity again and again and again, and you can use a tool like GIS to then put all these layers together. The really cool thing about this project is that we were also able to engage a number of women's groups. And so this was really neat because there were a couple of women who were actually hired by the illegal loggers to bring them food every day. And so if we hadn't engaged this group of women who were not professionals, they were not forest rangers, we never would have had all this information about what was happening in the north. We would have completely missed a massive part of the picture. And so, this idea of combining technical knowledge like land cover map, which is derived from satellite imagery, with participatory risk mapping data gives you, a way to then, integrate data. And so, this is a map that shows risk ranking. And so what we were able to do is find places where the participatory mappers agreed that the risk from illegal logging was really high. And then we also were really interested in authorities. And in this part of Madagascar, there are many different layers of authorities. So you can have local authorities, national, gendarme, park police. And so we kind of all called them police. But so the triangles represent authorities and the dots represent risk rankings. And so then you're able to sort of see, okay, well, here's a high risk place on top of an authority. So what's going on here? And then you can see, here's a really low risk area on top of authority. So this is a place where things are going right. And this is a place where things are going wrong. You can also see that people don't follow instructions. And when, they don't follow instructions, they provide really amazing, useful data. So this is where the local people know that the logs that are illegally taken from the forest are actually brought out by canoe to meet up at the container ships, where then they're brought over to places like Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, or China. And so then, you can get fancy with GIS, right? And so you can create risk layers, you can create predictive risk maps, and you can really look at agreement between authorities and local people. And so I call this like interdisciplinary intelligence mapping, because what I'm arguing is that, you have an organization on the ground that's trying to prevent illegal logging. And if they use one set of data, they're not going to be getting the full picture, right? It's going to be, like a two color map, right? And then the more information you have, the more color you have, the more voices that you have involved in the data collection procedure, it's more colorful, it's more detailed, it's more meaningful. And so then this enables, the folks on the ground to prioritize, okay, well, we have limited resources. Where are we going to invest where are we going to invest our resources? How are we going to invest our resources? When are we going to invest our resources? And so this informs decision making. And so, this has been a really empowering way for local individuals to capture their own information and use their own insight for decision making. I wanted to just give one more example of how kind of interdisciplinary methods from social science can be used. And this is with the topic of urban wild meat trafficking in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. So this is a project involving great apes, dwarf crocodiles, and pangolins into Kinshasa, which is a mega city of probably 13 million now. And what we were interested in doing, sorry, this is Republic of Congo. I'm going to show you what we were interested here is, this is in Democratic Republic of Congo, looking at different restaurant tiers, upper, middle, and lower, like according to the price on the menu. And then we wanted to look at the social network of these different restaurant tiers according to their source, transit, and destination. Where are they sourcing their products from? How do they move them? Where do they end up? And what's really interesting here is to see, I became then really interested in this transportation box over here. And then I was interested really in, well, what distinguishes what kind of mode of transportation people use? And we actually found a really interesting gender dimension here. Women use certain modes of transportation and men use other. And it's also women who are trafficking certain species use certain modes of transportation. So if you don't use these kind of social science techniques, you just completely miss the situation on the ground. If you are interested in protecting primates, and you don't understand these kind of gender dimensions or social network connections, again, you're missing a huge point of the conservation picture. We also look at crime clusters, like where does crime cluster in space? And I do a lot of participatory mapping with different groups. And so I believe that it's really useful to be able to measure like shared knowledge, integrate different sources of knowledge, right? And so what this shows you is groups are color coded here. So the green group is one, the red group is another, and the blue group is a third. And so what you see is on the map, different groups have different experiences and expertise. Duh, right? But now we can actually map it, and it's those areas of overlap that become really, really important for action and crime prevention. And so what's been really interesting is this most recent work that we've been doing is looking at crime place networks. And so there's a bunch of numbers on the map here. And so a lot of the times when you think about conservation crime, when you think about biodiversity conservation, you think of the one place where, hi, I'm giving a lecture. Mama? Yes, Rachel, I'm literally giving a lecture. Mama, please help me. Yeah, go right ahead. No, you help me. See, look at all my friends. There's like hundreds of them. See, they're all waving. Please go have your Italian ice, or then sit with me. Mama, you can help me get it. Okay, at 4 o'clock. No. So what's really cool about this particular, map is the 4 numbers. So in biodiversity conservation, we think about crime places and we focus our intervention there. The numbers 2, 3, and 4 are other places that local people can tell us where to go. Like, where do offenders go when they're not offending? Where are new offenders brought into the fold? Where does wildlife crime, in this case, urban bushmeat trafficking, intersect with other kinds of criminality, like drug trafficking or something like that? And so what we did is we asked people to use their lived experience and map these other places. And so that's what these 2, 3s, and 4s are on the map. What's really cool about this is that it illustrates that there are a whole lot of other intervention points to try to reduce illegal urban wild meat trafficking besides that one point where there's a market or things are coming into the city. So I hope that I've showed you a little bit of how I've tried to, okay, so how does this improve conservation outcomes? What's been really important is finding these other spaces is new opportunities for partnerships. So one of these numbers is a church. You can engage individuals with this church and they can help become new allies, for example, with a conservation community. And maybe these partnerships didn't exist before. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop. And hopefully I've provoked some sort of thinking about how conservation social science can be harnessed to sort of address some of these conservation problems that we have. And even though I focused on non-North America areas, I think these methods, these tools, these lessons, these failures are all relevant to what we're talking about here. So I'll stop with that and mute myself in case Rachel comes back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meredith. That was impressive. I have never seen somebody carry on a lecture mid child needs. So kudos. Thank you.
My pandemic learning. I can't tell you how many times I've had to get that kid an Italian ice out of the freezer. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you. Yes.
I think the moms on the call, I'm sure, really are heartwarmed by that. Thank you both. That was fantastic. I'm going to actually pass it over to Veronica, but I just wanted to say thank you for that. Wonderful. Those are both fascinating, and I'm really appreciative to you both for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Veronica. I'm a PhD student at Colorado State University in the Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department. And I actually consider myself a conservation social scientist, so I'm really excited to have these wonderful panelists. And I am going to lead us through a couple of questions for our panelists, and then please feel free to put any questions you all have in the chat. I might skip around and do some chat questions, just depends on how we're feeling today. So I think Meredith did a great job of kind of addressing the overall question that we're trying to address in this webinar, which is how can social science improve conservation outcomes? And we saw with Arundhati that you can also not only apply social science methods like participatory mapping, but social science theory. Both of these things combined can create just stronger, richer data, not just from kind of the ecological side or just from the social side, but blending those together and really understanding how systems work, how social ecological systems work. So I wanted to get started with an interesting question that I am always curious about with people who are in this field is, for both of you, how did you first become involved with conservation social science? Like, when did that become a thing that you knew about? I remember learning about it myself and not realizing that this was a field I could go into. And I'm sure there are some people on the call who are curious and maybe they've heard of what conservation social science is, but I know that there are many different ways to get into this field. So if you could talk about that for a little bit.
I can go first. Veronica, I think like you, I also had a similar experience. I was so deep into conservation social science before I realized it as a discipline, was existed. I think my work or my engagement with this work started when I was working in India, and it was I was interning during my master's with a local nonprofit, looking at and this was looking at both turtle conservation in the coast of Orissa, the state in the East Coast, and also understanding how local fisher groups engage with conservation. So at that point, it was, I think that engagement and the collaboration was necessary. So not engaging with social science wasn't really an option. It was, I've always looked at conservation biology, having the tools to recognize the problems, but conservation social science offering these methods of engagement with those problems. So from there, I started looking also at technological adoption, so how small-scale fisheries have evolved over time, which led me to my doctoral work around cook stove adoption. So I think that the social science component of this theory remained the same, just the context of that changed. And right when I was looking at this cook stove adoption, I started engaging with this theory that has driven or defined most of my work in this field.
I guess I really appreciate that origin story. I think it's really in many ways it mirrors a lot of my own, except in different places and different theories. I guess the only thing that I'll add is I remember when I was I get my bachelor's degree is in anthropology, and so I came at this from a human dimensions perspective. And I was an intern at Defenders of Wildlife in 1999, and I was like filing papers and I was filing scientific articles, and I was doing all this work on wolf restoration, right? So wolf restoration in the United States looked super different in the late 90s, but I was filing attitude surveys, and I was like, what's an attitude survey? And of course, like as an intern, I was reading what I was filing, and I was like, wow, there's like human attitudes that go into decision making. And then I actually got really frustrated that I saw a lot of science about wildlife conservation, and then I saw policy about wildlife conservation. And at that point I was like, why isn't science and policy working together? And so then I really became motivated to go get a PhD actually, and be a I got really angry at scientists for like not communicating their science to policymakers. And then I realized that I couldn't criticize them because that I should just go do it myself, because I couldn't criticize others. I should criticize myself. So, at that point I knew that I really wanted to be working in an interdisciplinary space. And I also think that some of it has to do with my, where I think I have just like a sense of empathy and interest. And so that also drives me a little bit in my decision making.
Awesome, thank you so much. Another question I have is, and it seems pretty simple of a question, but I have struggled with this in my own work. But how would each of you actually define conservation social science? Because it can mean a lot of different things. It's so interdisciplinary, and it also has different words like human dimensions or conservation psychology, social psychology, all of these different things go into this very broad field. So I'm wondering if each of you have a definition of conservation social science.
Arundhati, do you want to go first?
We can alternate.
Okay, I guess, so I'm like past president of the social science working group, you know, and I followed, you know, Tara Teal, who followed Mike Masha. So that was like amazing. And so I think I'll just say, and because I'm speaking to Society for Conservation Biology, in this regard, it was a big attempt as possible. And so I think I saw it as more of like a self-identity. Like, if this is a place where you feel like you can make a contribution and your science is enhanced and you are professionally and personally satisfied, then you belong. So I think, and I actually really appreciate that, because in a lot of other professional societies, it's like, oh no, you're too X or you're too Y, and so please go to another meeting or go to another working group. But I always found Society for Conservation Biology, again, we're not a perfect society, you know, I'm not saying that, but like as big attempt as possible. So if you're a scientist and you feel like you belong, please come, like, participate. I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, I also, I think, concur with at least the collaboration and how collaborative this discipline is. Veronica, all these different disciplines that you mentioned, the psychology and sociology, I think all of those are just subsets. But how I like to think of it, and I think I might be repeating myself, but just that conservation biology, I think there are these, you know, just like conservation biology, these tools and analytical methods and theories that we engage with to identify problems. Similarly, I think conservation social science also has a slew of theories and tools, you know, that they offer to, in ways, engage both with problems and solutions, and therefore, you know, contributing to these conservation outcomes. Because I think now we're also maybe at a stage where we no longer ask if conservation social science is important. I think the larger question is, how do we engage with it? So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Another kind of follow-up question. If there are maybe students or people in this call who don't have very much experience with conservation social science, what would be your advice for somebody trying to get into this field?
So I think one of the resources that I found really helpful is the scbsocialscience.org. I think there's a slew of, again, like, you know, a repository of resources, papers, seminars like this. I think these are really helpful, but also something that really benefited from, you know, with my training here is just writing to people whose work I like and identifying collaborations and engagements like that. So I think because this is, again, such a collaborative space, reaching out to people whose work you appreciate, identifying resources through them, that's another way to, yeah, build on that training.
I agree 100%. And the only other thing that I would add is that if you're at a university and you have like restrictive requirements, I would strongly encourage you to just ask, you know, like if you can find a class or find even if it's in a different department. You know, I do feel like universities these days really are trying to be in as much position of service to students as possible. So instead of saying like, oh, it's an either or, ask and how. Like, I want to take this class. How can I make this count? How can I get credit for this? How can this contribute to my degree program? And just keep asking. And I really do, you know, don't blame me, but just be like, keep asking. I think universities will say yes, we'll help you out on this eventually. Don't take no for an answer, I guess is what I'm saying.
That's great advice. Thank you. And so it looks like we have a question from the chat, which is a great question from Ryan. From your perspectives, what are the greatest challenges that still exist today in integrating elements of social science into conservation research and programming?
Am I first on that one? What are the biggest challenges? I mean, I think we're still really siloed. I think, you know, it's really wonderful to talk to like-minded people and to surround yourself with individuals that you have kind of like a shared identity with. But I think projects are still really siloed. I think conservation organizations are still really siloed. And I think that universities are really siloed. The funding is siloed. The evaluation is siloed. And so in some ways, like the broader system is kind of set up sometimes to have things really stovepiped. And so it's like breaking those down. And sometimes you can't break down the structure, so you have to just find people working within that structure to help you build bridges. That's a lame answer, but that's a really hard question.
I feel the same way. Meredith, it's just, I think some of the challenges or maybe just opportunities also in looking at, you know, how, I guess a lot of the, I hope things are changing, but initially, you know, a lot of the burden of who engages with who was always, okay, let's engage social scientists into the solution part of the, you know, of the problem framing, but not necessarily right in the beginning. A lot of that is changing. I think there's focus on co-designing and collaborative work right from the start. So that I think is a wonderful opportunity, but also something that we maybe, I think there's a lot more work required is integrating critical social sciences into conservation. I think that's something we've just started scratching the surface of and looking at how conservation works using this critical social science lens to see how we can further restructure or decolonize how we engage with these sciences.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Another question that I have is, this may be changing because I know that the field is getting bigger and more acknowledged. But have you, either of you, received any pushback from scientists, agencies, organizations about your research methods or anything like that for kind of this dichotomy between like soft science and hard science? This is a hard question to ask, but I know that there is a little bit of an issue of social science trying to prove itself as a quote unquote real science. And I know there are so many discussions we could have with the definition of science itself. But I'm wondering if you've seen a change over your career, or if you've had anything like that happen to you where people are questioning if you're actually a scientist.
I can start with that. Fortunately for me, and I think that's, you know, just because of a lot of the work and the effort of people who came before me, I didn't have to face this challenge in my work. And I think I've just been lucky or just extremely fortunate. Not to say that kind of problem doesn't exist or that kind of framing doesn't exist, but in most of the collaborations I have built, there's a recognition that yes, we need to engage with social scientists for this work. We need them for problem framing. We need them for designing good research. And I've seen a similar focus even with funding organizations and how they are, you know, looking for what social science theories are you engaging with, and how are you, who are you working with, who are your collaborators. So I think I may have benefited from just people who have put in a lot more effort into this. But yeah, I think I just consider myself very lucky.
I have not had that experience, and I think that's fantastic, because it enables you to focus your effort and cognitive energy on other things. Yes, all of the above, Veronica, like quant qual, applied basic, you know, I see a lot of disciplinary competition, like theoretical competition. I get it because I'm a female. I think sometimes I come across as being younger than I am because I'm very immature. I'm youthful, or something like that. So a lot of the times I get like ageist comments, and then I get, you know, comments that are specific to the whatever that problem is, you know, like if it's wolf conservation, or if it's, you know, lemur conservation, or if it's, you know, sea cucumbers, you know, it's like different groups and different conservation stories. So yes, and I guess that one way that I try to look at that within a scientific perspective is that if people are responding, that means that they're paying attention to me in some regard. And so I'm going to take advantage, and I'm going to do the best that I can to sort of represent myself and my science and what I have to offer. And I'm going to be like friendly about it, but I'm also going to be like, look, like, hey, this is great natural science research, but gosh, if you just included people, imagine what could happen here, you know? And I guess the other thing is that I do try to respect that not everybody is interested in or has the capacity to do interdisciplinary science or do social conservation social science. And so I would like people to respect me for being a conservation social scientist and using mixed methods. So I should then respect you. So I don't know how helpful that is, but I think it's probably best to prepare yourself to have some sort of conflictual conversation with somebody at some point. And that's like a great, actually, when I was a graduate student, we used to talk about this thing with like our grad group, you know, like that's a great thing to do role playing with. And if you're the type of person like me who likes to like, you know, like talk it out first or practice first or something, that's a great thing to role play with your grad group.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, Dr. Teresio, I took one of her courses, and in it we just a little assignment was just to write out a response to some kind of criticism or some kind of like, well, why are you doing that? What is your research? So I thought that was actually really helpful and not something I would have thought about before. And I think if I was confronted, I would feel a little bit like, oh, like, what do I say? But actually rehearsing that is a great tip. So thank you. It looks like we have some questions from the chat. All right, so we have somebody who is the first time hearing about conservation social science, and they're wondering, how is it different from political ecology of conservation?
I'm not a political ecologist, but I know a lot of them. So I don't know if there's anybody who's like a political ecologist here, but my understanding is that political ecology really has a number of strengths regarding power and how power, either of organizations or individuals, institutions, you know, how that kind of comes into play, and how power can be a lens with which to think about conservation problems and solutions. I guess I would say that political ecology would be one type of conservation social science, and political ecology could be combined with other kinds of conservation social science, like conservation psychology. So I would say it's like a smaller part of it.
Yeah, likewise. I agree. I think it's within conservation social sciences, and we talk of these different disciplines that one can engage with. Political ecology is one of those lenses to look at these as well.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from the chat. Being in an interdisciplinary research environment, I often feel the imposter syndrome. Do either of you also sometimes feel this way? And if so, how do you overcome this feeling? I think you're muted, Arundhati.
Sorry. I think just initially when I started off in this field, and this is not just pertaining to, I think, interdisciplinary research environment, I think this keeps coming back in various different roles you take on, the different organizations, and the more people you work with. So yes, I think sometimes it creeps up, and I think there's definitely I think knowing enough people are engaging with similar problems at similar scales, and having that research support group has been really important for me, having that support system. But I don't know if it's, I think I'm trying to basically engage with imposter syndrome not as a handicap anymore. I think there's more that we can learn to engage with, more that it allows us to do is also, I think, that kind of vulnerability and confidence that it allows us to cultivate. I think those are strengths to look at. But it's been really helpful to have a wonderful group of colleagues and friends that really help, and recognizing that everyone is learning and doing things at the same time.
I think this is a fantastic question, and I would just say yes. I think almost every single human being that I know has some sort of imposter syndrome at some point, so you're not alone. I feel like an imposter all the time, and so the way that I look at it is that I try to identify that feeling of imposition or being the imposter, and that's how I'm different. And my differences are usually why I've been invited to the table, because I look at the problem differently, because I have a different lived experience, my professional expertise. Like my differences represent something positive, right? And so I try to look at that place where I feel like I'm an imposter. That's my difference, and my difference is my strength. And so I guess I try to flip it on its head, just like Arundhati said. And so I think if you're lucky enough to feel imposter syndrome, then you're lucky enough to be able to identify that thing that makes you unique. And that's kind of awesome because that means that that's something special that you bring to the problem. And hello, conservation needs all the help it can get because we're in a crowded situation. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. Those were great responses. And yes, I agree. I think all of us experience imposter syndrome, no matter where you are in your career. So speaking of careers, I know there might be some students here today, and a lot of the questions that we think about is, okay, conservation social science, that's really cool to study, but what can I actually do with that? So what are the types of jobs, careers, fields, contexts that somebody can work in as a conservation social scientist?
I think first of all, I think it's really good to be thinking about your career, right? That's like important. And so certainly, there are conservation organizations that are looking, there are federal agencies that are looking. And, I also see a lot of like private industry and like philanthropy, being relevant here. I guess I might suggest looking in places that are somewhat non-traditional because, even like a Department of Treasury or, finance or communication or, I think that conservation social science is like a really unique analytical badge that you can wear. And so I think there's just a lot of places out there that you can really make a contribution. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think I work at a nonprofit which has a dedicated social science team. So it's really worked out well for me. But I think I'm also, every conversation within our organizations also stems from, okay, interdisciplinary problem solving. So I think this kind of interdisciplinary lens is not going to go away. And I think more and more as we start engaging with these problems, it's only going to become more required, more needed. So any contributions that you have as conservation social scientists is going to only gain more value in the coming years. So I think Meredith mentioned a few, federal agencies, nonprofits, even within academia, there's so many these integrative conservation programs now that I think Colorado State has one, University of Georgia has one. So these would also be interesting avenues to look at. So again, not just in terms of applied spaces, but also in academia, there are spaces that are being created for conservation social science.
I just want to add, recently, my collaborators, like today I was talking to somebody at the National Defense University. I collaborate with materials engineers, like that build airplane rivet parts, like legit rivets. I have 2 National Science Foundation grants that are in the engineering directorate, one with computer scientists and one with an operation engineer. Like, conservation social science is everywhere. So, I mean, I think that those of us that have an interdisciplinary spin, or like a lens, I think that you can really flex your identity and kind of think about, to somebody studying rivets, this is what I'm going to talk about. And to somebody studying computers, I'll kind of use this language. As a conservation social scientist, you're kind of well positioned to be that like translator to start.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And we are almost done with our webinar, but I have one last question if you both can answer quickly. So what do you think are the next steps in conservation social science? What are you excited about? What needs to be explored more? Anything in that kind of realm?
Give it a shot. So I think in terms of next steps, I think more and more such work is needed. I think institutionalizing and mainstreaming this kind of work in conservation, that's always something to look forward to. I'm really excited about different ways and just the multiple ways of knowing and the kind of papers that are being published. It's really exciting to see this kind of engagement. And some of the examples Meredith said, I'd be really curious to look at engineering and social science and how those overlap. So I think those kind of collaborations, really excited about. I think something that I would love to explore more or just learn more about is how critical social sciences can inform conservation practice and this whole conversation around decolonizing conservation. But I think there's just some work to be done in that realm.
2 things. We need to do more work on the gender dimensions of conservation, and gender is not synonymous with women. So we need to be thinking about the gender dimensions, and we need to decolonize conservation. It's period.
Thank you so much.
I like the last one. The 2 last one, I like Meredith.
Yes. Thank you both to our panelists so much for taking the time to talk with us all today. Thank you everybody who showed up for this webinar. We hope you took something away. I know that Meredith is happy to share an email address, and we'll talk to Arundhati too, so we can send out a message to all of you when the recording goes up, and we can send out any other information that either of the panelists wants to share with the group. But thank you all so much for being here. And I think this was a great way to close out our webinar series.
Thank you so much for having me. And Arundhati, it was